Attempting to capitalize on the revival, don't call it a comeback, and resurgence of the Dungeons & Dragons franchise was an online multiplayer RPG nearly forgotten in time. Before Larian stepped into the world of D&D to make a game of their own set to launch sometime in the future, there was Sword Coast Legends, with the soundtrack being covered by Dragon Age Origins composer and utilizing an adaptation of the D&D 5th edition rule set. Inspired by the legendary Neverwinter Nights, Sword Coast Legends was set to bring a DM-like experience to online multiplayer, giving players the ability to customize their own modules utilizing the toolset in both pre-produced and live time. Not long after the launch of Sword Coast Legends, the company behind the game, Inspace, would suddenly shut down, and within 2 years, Sword Coast Legends was pulled from Steam due to licensing issues. With servers reportedly closed in July of 2018, Sword Coast Legends, which was supposed to create a legacy hopefully at least a fraction of the significance and staying power as Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2, which are still played online, was never able to match the colossal expectations set forth. So what went wrong with Sword Coast Legends, the first of the D&D video game RPGs to come following the massive resurgence of the series? On this episode of Death of a Game Detectives, we will venture off the beaten path thanks to a viewer who requested this video personally from me and paid my food for a full month in a time of need, and cover a multiplayer online game that tried to capture the audience of one of my top 3 favorite games of all time, Neverwinter Nights. The story starts back with the founding of the company set to bring forth a D&D game to the modern age, Inspace, back in 1993. Inspace by 2010, to jump forward a little bit, had 17 years of game development experience, consisting mostly of handheld ports and various major IP spin-off type titles. Their biggest title was probably Geist, a zany first-person shooter that was a bit of a flop, developed in partnership with Nintendo. Possibly a first on the series, we have a developer already facing cliff's edge, with a rumor of Inspace shutting down back in 2010 before the story actually even begins. Inspace wouldn't shut down, but signs of the developer on the ropes by as early as 2010 paint quite the picture for things moving forward. 2014 was the year that Dungeons & Dragons, the pioneer fantasy tabletop role-playing game from the 70s, would release their 5th edition rule set to in many ways simplify certain mechanics and make the game more appealing to a broader audience. The success has been undeniable, making the 5th edition arguably the most successful yet. If 2014 was the year that the mainstream got whiff of Dungeons & Dragons again, then 2015 was the year that Dungeons & Dragons was fully thrusted back into the mainstream, with the absolute massive success of Critical Role, a web series DM'd by Matthew Mercer featuring well-known voice actors and done all on livestream. Critical Role was able to show everyone just how fun and successful Dungeons & Dragons was capable of being played at the highest level. Amidst the revival and resurgence, Inspace would secure arguably their biggest contract yet. Taking place in the Forgotten Realms setting, specifically the Sword Coast region, a famed and popular setting for this series and dubbed Sword Coast Legends. More details would be revealed February 2015, such as it being a multiplayer online RPG featuring the 5th edition D&D rule set, also capable of offline single-player play with AI companions. The single-player RPG would be a standard but promised fun and exciting CRPG experience. Online RPG component would feature a DM mode akin to a tabletop RPG experience that could influence the game in both live and pre-constructed environments and campaigns for players. This would sort of mimic the multiplayer experience in arguably the best D&D based game of all time, also a third-person top-down CRPG, Neverwinter Nights, probably my top 3 favorite game behind Star Wars Galaxies and KOTOR 2. How detailed the custom tools would be weren't exactly detailed in the press release, but this would be absolutely critical as Neverwinter Nights featured arguably one of the best tool sets ever. Essentially just the same tools that the developers used to create the game itself, offering unparalleled customization and variety options. Sword Coast Legends was proudly proclaiming that no scripting would be needed with their tools, as all tools would be utilized in-game using an interface. But would that ultimately be a good thing? I was quite obsessed with making my own modules as a teenager in Neverwinter Nights, as I'm sure others were watching this video. Even as a kid I could figure out some basic scripting, and the idea of accomplishing what Neverwinter Nights did without scripting, it just seems hard if you don't have the scripting in there. Sword Coast Legends, as mentioned, would be featuring the 5th edition rule set from D&D as well. Well, at least it sort of would be. Another interview with InSpace concerning SCL, and it was stated that the title would be utilizing a adapted 5th edition rule set. This can be alarming to some fans, especially the purists, as tampering with the rule set can yield some unintended and unforeseen circumstances. But technically speaking, titles like Knights of the Old Republic, Baldur's Gate, and Neverwinter Nights also utilized adapted rule sets versus straight lifting from the tabletop D&D rulebook. The medium difference requires some things to be handled differently. For example, if a round lasts too long in an action-style combat scenario, it feels kind of boring or disjointed in a video game, even if online RPGs aren't necessarily known for fast-paced gameplay. A tabletop game of D&D, sometimes you can spend an hour of a play session just shopping in a store for a frame of reference and time differentials between the two. Social gameplay is far more of a focus in a tabletop game. March 9th, 2015, we would have a first look at Sword Coast Legends and notice true CRPG roots. Showcasing the single-player campaign in Sword Coast Legends, the gameplay felt more like a Pathfinder RPG experience than Neverwinter. It felt actually like a D&D title, and less like a straight action RPG. There were more things like skill checks and relying on the skill of your party, versus them just being combat classes, like in a game like Dragon Age Origins. SCL clearly was targeting the classic RPG crowd, which was probably a good idea considering there was some overlap between the CRPG audience and the D&D players. Plus, Forgotten Realms-based RPGs have been rather successful on PC, to say the least, with legendary titles like some mentioned already, Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, Icewind Dale, and even Planescape Torment. There's even more recent successes in the CRPG genre, like Pillars of Eternity, Divinity OS 2, Pathfinder Kingmaker. The CRPG genre is not going anywhere anytime soon. Sword Coast Legends was trying to tap into some of this gargantuan audience. Sword Coast Legends would demonstrate their DM mode gameplay at the end of March 2015, where the ease of use and access was on full display. Well, at least the portion centered around doing such live as players progressed through the dungeon. Players were more so focused on asking about the pre-produced campaigns and modules, hoping that these would allow for some more in-depth level of customization. An issue you can see forming quite early on, even in the promotional material regarding Sword Coast Legends, was the game's over-focus and over-reliance on combat. The entire premise of a DM, 1 versus 4 gameplay, is built in the game as PvP. This is not what the D&D experience is on tabletop. Sure, a DM can make things competitive and sometimes even kill a player, challenge the players, and so on and so forth as they should, but a DM also works with players to uncover parts of their story and build the relationships with the party. None of this was being seen in the trailer or the first look footage, which was worrying to say the least. Neverwinter Nights multiplayer sessions weren't just magical because they were combat simulators or dungeon crawlers, but because of the deep social gameplay and customization that the game would offer. I know from experience I spent many a night in a tavern. Sword Coast Legends would have its launch date set at E3 2015 for later in the fall, September 8th, 2015. You could pre-order the full game for just $35 or $60 for the digital deluxe edition, which came with extra DM abilities, in-game bonuses, and various starter items. The pre-orders were rather generous for the extra versions though, as they offered multiple regular copies of the game as well so you could play with your friends. Sword Coast Legends would also offer a free DLC to those who pre-ordered the game, which was a nice little consolation. InSpace would work with famed video game composer Einan Zur of Fallout and Dragon Age Origins fame on the soundtrack for Sword Coast Legends, certainly giving the game an air of legitimacy and quality. A compelling soundtrack would serve a CRPG tabletop-inspired multiplayer title quite well, but with so little details concerning the game's story, and a good soundtrack wouldn't be enough alone to carry Sword Coast Legends. If the single player wasn't captivating enough, it would greatly weaken the game's viability. Putting so many eggs in the DM mode multiplayer basket just didn't seem so smart when the entire thing was being built on being easy to use, not necessarily deep. Announced September 22nd, 2015, was a delay for Sword Coast Legends of a few weeks, now pushing the launch to October 20th, 2015. Game director and main in-space boss Dan Tudge, responsible for producing Dragon Age Origins, would state that the decision to delay the launch wasn't an easy one, but stemmed from player feedback and a desire to polish the game. This feedback came from the head start offered to pre-orderers of the game that ran in multiple phases throughout September. The impressions were worrying enough to push for a delay, which wasn't a good sign. Would just a few weeks of a delay be enough to really polish anything but some bugs here and there anyway? Sword Coast Legends would launch October 20th, 2015 after a short delay meant to address co-op issues on PC. On aggregate review website Metacritic, Sword Coast Legends would score a 61 out of 100 from 39 different critics, faring much worse with users at 5.5 out of 10. On Steam, Sword Coast Legends would sell somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 copies and score a 58% mixed review score. Starting with the critical reception, IGN would score SCL a 5.5 out of 10, where they stated that poor creation tools and an aversion to genuine, interesting decision-making keep Sword Coast Legends from succeeding. IGN would cite dual cooldown-based combat, linear quests, and a cookie-cutter DM system as reasons for the game being quite forgettable, even in the age of the CRPG renaissance. PC Gamer would give the game a 55 out of 100, calling it a straightforward cliché that feels out of place in the new wave of CRPGs. An issue highlighted in PC Gamer's review was concerning the DM mode being limited in more ways than just options offered, but also structure, effectively making the quest structures in multiplayer much like the 30-hour single-player campaigns, with very little variance, with 3 options to talk to a person, or 3 places to go search, or just the overabundance of kill quests. The DM can't really affect parts of the gameplay that would affect players the greatest due to the DM interface's limitations. This goes back to what we stated at the start concerning the danger of abandoning scripting or event triggering in a toolset versus a streamlined interface presented in Sword Coast Legends. Neverwinter Nights allowed you to create triggers, which is basically scripting, greatly opening up the ability to perform greater and more ambitious action, as well as create branching dialogue. I was able to do most of this as a kid, so it wasn't entirely too complicated of a process. This made it to where it wasn't just a dungeon simulator or a dungeon creator. It was really just mimicking elements of D&D's pen and paper toolkit as best as you could in a video game. N-Space choosing ease of access over depth of ability was proving to be a crucial mistake. It made the game inevitably more reliant on having good combat and mechanics, which sadly it didn't. D&D fans also expect a high level of customization, as pen and paper offers the ultimate level of this, since you can basically do anything. It's not realistic to expect video games to match this yet, but when Sword Coast Legends offerings are as limited as they were, it understandably was taken even worse. This is where Sword Coast Legends being marketed to both D&D fans and CRPG fans found itself in a bit of a pickle. They weren't able to offer enough depth for D&D fans to create the kind of content they wanted, but even worse, they had violated some cardinal sins in the world of Dungeons & Dragons. When players got the chance to play Sword Coast Legends, they found inspired by 5th edition rules to be closer to the truth, and inspired still might be a bit too extreme. Sword Coast Legends, like many other D&D adapted titles, was utilizing a modified rule set. Problem being, they removed the concept of rounds altogether, and basically made all abilities and spells cooldown based, like an MMORPG or a standard RPG. Not only did this not match the identity of a D&D game, this led to very unbalanced feeling combat where changing difficulty levels only seemed to really change the enemy's HP bar. Some fans felt betrayed by this realization as they expected Sword Coast Legends to be a 5th edition based RPG. I fall somewhere in the middle of this, because although Sword Coast Legends did pre-launch state they would be adapting the rule set in the first place, they did clearly market towards the 5th edition hype, and the D&D audience in general, and had to have some forethought to know that fans would be angry if you steered too far away from the rules. Removing the concept and gameplay elements of rounds from the game was a far departure from a D&D styled game, and fans were reacting accordingly. If Sword Coast Legends gave up some of these things to lean more into the CRPG elements of the game and excel there, it would make sense. After all, Divinity's DM mode isn't super in-depth either, right? The problem is the single-player campaign and CRPG elements in SCL aren't very impressive either, and are fairly run-of-the-mill, including the poorly delivered inconsistent quality voice acting and repeating quests. There wasn't proving to be that much redeemable about Sword Coast Legends period, beside just the concept, with the visual identity of the game being quite generic on top of everything. With peak population numbers barely eclipsing 3,983 players peak and 707 players concurrent, it was safe to say Sword Coast Legends had flopped. Coming as a shock to those who only knew InSpace from Sword Coast Legends or didn't hear about the various rumors swirling the company before the game's launch would be news that InSpace, after 21 years in game development, would be shutting down March 31st, 2016. The exact reasons concerning this were quite lock and key, but the company president Dan O'Leary was quite positively spoken of in spite of this event, which could point to factors sort of out of their control. But what would that mean for their just released online RPG though? Well, despite the shuttering of InSpace, Sword Coast Legends, in one of the most interesting moves I've seen on the series yet, would still go ahead with their first promised DLC, Rage of Demons. Rage of Demons would launch May 18th, 2016, and come with it the Underdark and the Story of Drizzt. The DLC would be free to all players who pre-ordered the game, and would also come with new tile sets, objects, the Tiefling race, new creatures, and the Warlock class. The population, which had dropped down to 201 peak players in April, jumped back up to 941 players peak, but just 190 average. Although Rage of Demons was a positively received update, it unfortunately came just after all of the air had been drained out of the balloon. The little bump the population got wasn't sustainable with no future in sight for Sword Coast Legends, being effectively a Ronin online video game at this point. While some titles don't even follow through with their promise to come to consoles even when the company isn't shuttered, Sword Coast Legends would actually still launch on consoles July 19th, 2016 with the Rage of Demons DLC included. While Steam charts don't showcase the population on consoles, the population by the end of 2016 on PC was in the 200s, and mere 80s for average concurrent players. The console population wasn't very likely to move the needle enough to bring back InSpace from the dead, or keep the title afloat though. By December 2017, Sword Coast Legends would be dealt another critical blow, when the license would expire with D&D and the title would be pulled from Steam altogether. This would mark the last time the game would be purchasable. The following year wasn't any kinder to Sword Coast Legends, who was already nearing death's door at that point. May 25th, 2018, and it would be announced that Sword Coast Legends would be shutting down their game servers July 25th, 2018. This would anger some fans because InSpace had promised previously to leave servers up for an indefinite amount of time, but it's not like they could take their complaints up with a shuttered company, right? PC servers for Sword Coast Legends would shut down July 25th, 2018, but the servers would still remain up for console players. With InSpace long gone by this point, all that was left was the small dedicated fans who saw the value in Sword Coast Legends or wish it could have soared like it was promised. But with no future, no developer, and now no servers, Sword Coast Legends had reached the end of its rope. Something painfully obvious throughout this video, but not something I have addressed yet, is the elephant in the room, InSpace, the developer behind the game. Their primary game development background had been in handheld spin-off video games. With Sword Coast Legends, they were, like with Geist, punching up their weight class. And it didn't work out well for them. InSpace seemed to lack the development ability to handle something as ambitious as Sword Coast Legends, which was trying to be a spiritual successor to Neverwinter Nights, one of the greatest games of all time. They very likely didn't even have a budget big enough to even do it either, as apparent in things like their voice acting and lack of overall promotion. It's difficult to do a CRPG, let alone a CRPG DM tabletop simulator type multiplayer game on top of it. But when you're going up against the likes of BioWare, Obsidian, Larian Studios, and Owlcat Studios, you better have the talent and money to compete, otherwise you're gonna get outpaced, to put very nicely. Is that my music? Well, detectives, that means it's time for the final deduction. There's been enough clues and evidence obtained thus far, so let's put this case to bed. Too antagonistic of a game for a D&D CRPG fanbase. Fails to wow with mechanics and minute-to-minute gameplay. The DM editing tools are too limited. Ambitious projects helmed by an inexperienced developer. The developer shut down. They didn't choose a target audience and just stick with it. Loosely enforced the highly touted and advertised D&D 5th edition rules, aka angered the nerds. In the end, with Sword Coast Legends, we have a title that might inspire future developers to attempt to do something similar, or at least learn from the colossal mistakes made. Sword Coast Legends is a story of trying to do too much, and in the end, just about pissing off every end of the whole thing in the process. Picking a target audience and sticking with it is absolutely crucial for a game to have any longevity, because hybrid approaches are nice and all, but if you manage to anger or disappoint both sides of the picture, you're not going to have any legs to stand on in the end. At least we can still go play Neverwinter Nights, and wait for Larian's D&D game. Thanks for watching, detectives.
What is Eternum?